Hi there everyone, welcome to our first video for the first module for Introduction to Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into sort of what is women, gender, sexuality studies? What is this field? What is this field intended to study? How does it work? And thereby you can begin to learn, okay, here's what it is that I'm going to learn from this class. Here's the skill set I'm going to take away from being in this environment and taking this class for this semester. And to begin with, I think we should clarify that women, gender, sexuality studies is not simply the study of women and other gendered, sexed, or sexual minorities. So I tend to use this formulation, gendered, sexed, sexual, because these are some of the central categories of women, gender, sexuality studies, is to think about the sort of psychological and social dimensions of gender, what people often think of as the biological nature of sex, and of course our sexual relations with one another. These are all going to be important critical concepts as we investigate women, gender, sexuality studies. Part of what we're going to do today is to put special kind of critical scrutiny on that idea that we've all heard of before, right? Which is sex, right? We are often told that sex is something biological, right? It's simply your chromosomes or your hormones or your genitals or whatever, your reproductive system and so on. And sex is the real driver of, gendered differences on this account. And in order to really get, the perspective of women, gender, and sexuality studies even started, we have to have a very rigorous and strenuous critique of that idea. So part of the reason why women, gender, sexuality studies is not just like acquiring more and more information about women or other gender, sexual, sexed minorities is because there are, plenty of avenues for doing that are not, ostensibly feminist in any way at all, right? There are, for example, right-wing investigations of women or right-wing investigations of gender or sexed or sexual relationships. There is, the domain of sexology, which has existed in medicine, far longer than women, gender, sexuality studies departments have existed in the university. And, there are more, mundane examples of disciplines that focus on simply acquiring, say, information about women's opinions or something like that, right? And psychological surveys and the like. These are not the sort of thing that you're going to find in a WGSS class, right? And the reason why is not because we're unfair to these other disciplines or whatever, but because they don't do what women, gender, sexuality studies is meant to do. And so I've written here that WGSS, women, gender, sexuality studies, is defined not by its object of inquiry, but by the problem it seeks to address, which is something like gendered, sexed, and sexual injustice. So just to give a little bit of history about, the nature of women's studies departments, is that they are a relatively recent addition to the university atmosphere. Certain disciplines, like mathematics, for example, can claim, more or less, there are some complications, but claim to be studied at the university level for 2,000 plus years. When Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, started his own academy, he placed special stress on the importance of mathematics. And so mathematics has, in a way, been there with educational institutions since the very beginning. But by contrast, many women, gender, sexuality studies departments, I think, colloquially people just call them women's studies departments, came into the existence in the United States after various, feminist women's marches, made significant political pressure on universities to include the perspective of these, political theorists, activists that were trying to push the university in a new direction. So, if biology or physics, for example, is just the study of life or the study of physical objects or something like that, women, gender, sexuality studies is not simply the study of women or something like that, but is instead a political discipline that emerged from a very, very specific political problem, which is that women found, and this movement gradually expanded to include the perspectives of people beyond just women, right? But realized that they were facing shared collective problems and rallied together politically to try to address those problems where possible. There are many connections that are often drawn between the women's movements in the United States during this period and the civil rights movements. We can see both of these movements as, groups of people that are bound together by a kind of common problem, a kind of common, source of issue, and seek to address it by various kinds of political means. And while there are various kinds of assessment of the outcomes of these political movements, one of the things that it generated really was the expansion of women, gender, sexuality studies departments across universities in the United States. And so this is in many ways, sort of like the history of women's studies, is that it is fundamentally, and in a certain sense at least irrevocably, tied to feminism as a kind of social and political movement, right? So whereas, perhaps physics or biology and so on can at least claim to be apolitical, the fundamental nature of women's studies as a field is that it's intending to, offer a contribution to various kinds of political discussions, and so is fundamentally political. It seeks to advance, the goals of various particular groups of people. And so this is generally how women's studies departments formed in universities. Is it was a demand on the part of various political activists to take women's knowledge and women's experiences seriously. And that's where sort of the spiritual home of women, gender, sexuality studies begins. Of course, this is a very, very schematic and abstract description of the origins of women, gender, sexuality studies, but it's intended merely to give you a sense of what makes women, gender, sexuality studies so special. The central purpose of women, gender, sexuality studies is not necessarily to generate new knowledge that's going to, get the university a grant or necessarily be, valued by some potential employer or something like that. To the contrary, women, gender, sexuality studies is meant to critically interrogate various kinds of patriarchal or misogynist or generally sexist ideas that permeate in our culture and create problems in our collective everyday life, right? Even if you're not, for example, a woman, you might also often find that the political problems faced by women reflects personal struggles that you also have to go through. And so you should be in solidarity with women, even if you don't necessarily share in their problems. So articulating sort of the history of the feminist movement, how the feminist movement gradually expands in its scopes and its aims is like, a very central part of any women, gender, sexuality studies class introduction. And so what I want to do for this first video, for our first discussion forum, is to really focus on a kind of technique or a tool that feminists very often use. And this tool is often referred to or called denaturalization. That's, maybe a $2 word or something like that, but the idea is simple, right? Certain aspects of our lives are said to be just like the result of nature. It's not a social problem, it's a natural problem. And, for a long time, a patriarchal society, one structured around the interests and advantage of men, was justified on the basis that, like, nature itself, in a way, preferred men, or nature itself, the division between various biological characteristics between men and women justified the existing political structure, which, is said to recapitulate these differences. So, it's a very common sentiment for people to say that, women are biologically weaker and so on, right? And so they belong at the home, they belong child rearing and so on, right? And this is just like the natural way that things are, the natural way that things should be. And so feminists, who want to try to argue that patriarchy, the systematic advantage of men, privileging of men in society is unjust, then part of what they need to demonstrate is that it's not merely a consequence of our nature, right? It's not a consequence of our biology, but is instead a kind of social institution, right? It's not simply that women are worse than men or something like that, and hence are systematically disadvantaged, but instead that we as a society decided to systematically disadvantage women, and then our excuse for that fact, right, is that it somehow corresponds with a natural or a biological kind of fact. So the feminist, in responding to this kind of argument, one thing that you want to say is that you are getting the biology, you're getting the even just the sex stuff incorrect. That there is no direct license between the way that sex works biologically and the way that our society works socially and politically. So the reason why our readings and so on are set up the way that they are is that I want us for this first week to really have an example of a kind of feminist critique. And in this case, I want us to examine some texts that offer something like a feminist critique of the idea of biological sex. Now, of course, this doesn't simply mean that there is no biology, or sex doesn't exist fully, or there are no even sexual characteristics or anything like that, right? All it means is that the facts of biological sex do not justify, the existence of a patriarchal society, one that systematically advantages men and disadvantages women, right? we'll also see that this idea of a sexual binary actually hurts more people than just women, who are the disadvantaged, sort of class in this situation. In particular, our readings focus very often on the situation of intersex and transgender people, because if you're intersex, then you also are disadvantaged by a society that is structured around preserving a kind of gendered binary. Similarly, trans people seek to move on from the gender or sex that has been assigned to them, right? And so they also offer a kind of challenge to the idea that there's sort of like a rigid binary, that binary is located in sex, that binary sex is entirely natural, and all of the cases where phenomena don't meet that idea of biological sex, that it's somehow unnatural, right? We need to critique this idea, both in the name of women, but also in the name of various other kind of gendered and sexed minorities that are also systematically disadvantaged and hurt by this view. And so to, explain some of the central insights that we can get from Fausto Sterling and Paisley Currah, I've written a few of the really choice quotations from each of the 3 readings I would like you to do for the first half of this module. The first comes from Fausto Sterling's The 5 Sexes. The second comes from Fausto Sterling, The 5 Sexes Revisited. And the third comes from Paisley Currah, Sex is as Sex Does. Now, the first quote says something about, broadly Western culture or Western society. Fausto Sterling says, quote, "Western culture is deeply committed to the idea that there are only 2 sexes." And this should be very familiar to us, right? So, for example, dorm systems, are set up so that there are men and women, right? Bathrooms are set up so that there are men's bathrooms and women's bathrooms. We divide a whole number of activities around the supposed dichotomy between the 2 kinds of people that we think exist in society, men and women. And this is kind of like a social fact, right? Insofar as you are born into a society like ours, very often people will ask, well, are you a man or are you a woman, right? And it's thought that no matter what it is that you psychologically have to say about that matter, that there is something biological, which is something like a final fact of the matter, that will slide you into one category or the other, right? So this is the kind of fantasy view that feminism and feminist critique is meant to, in some way, kind of dissolve. And how does it do that? Well, it does it through what I've articulated in the second quote here. This is from your textbook, the Fausto Sterling, The 5 Sexes Revisited. Here she says, quote, "The 2-sex system embedded in our society is not adequate to encompass the full spectrum of human sexuality." Fausto Sterling brings up examples of intersex children, which can constitute as much as, I think the highest number reported is 4% of the population. These people have maybe some biological or sexed characteristics of one sex and some characteristics of the other, right? And this creates a problem for sort of classification criteria. If you think about it, we actually think that sex is a lot of different things. And biologists actually disagree with one another about what exactly sex really is, right? Is sex chromosomal? Well, that creates certain kinds of problems because your chromosomes don't necessarily line up with other secondary sex characteristics. Is sex just your hormones? If so, that's something that, is malleable, something that actually can and does change over an individual's lifespan. Moreover, if our sex is located in our hormone levels, right, how do we draw those lines? How do you decide, at what hormone levels you become what sex, and so on? People try to say that sex is various secondary sex characteristics, right? So, like, if you have a beard, or if you have a more slender or less slender kind of face, right? These are all, or maybe more muscular or less muscular. These are sex characteristics that often correspond with either testosterone or estrogen, right? This is also something that people think that sex is. But this is another case where it's not exactly clear, right, that there's one set of criteria that neatly divides all of humanity into simply one category or the other. Instead, it seems like you're talking about a whole cluster of characteristics. And the nature of biology is such that there is immense variety, right? Much, much more variety than is actually contained in many of our categories. There are various other ways that you might think about what sex is. Some people think that sex is your genitals, right? What genitals you had or what genitals you were born with. Some people think that sex is nothing but your gender being something like your psychological and social identity as a man or a woman, right? Which sometimes obviously does not correspond with how other people have labeled you or categorized you. And, for a very long time, whether or not you were sexed correctly was seen as a consequence of your sexuality, right? There was a presumption that no longer really exists, right? That society is heterosexual and normal people are heterosexual. So if you're a man, you should like women, and if you're a woman, you should like men, right? And so sexuality was, especially in the 19th century and before, but also well into the 20th century, taken as a sign of your sex. And so what is the point of all of this? Well, the point is to say that it's not really like biology has one simple idea of like what sex is or something like that can rigidly assign it to all of humanity such that we arrive at two and only two categories, men and women, right? To the contrary, just the nature of biology as well as the diversity of human experience is such that these characteristics often happen in clusters, right? And those clusters are not really amenable to a dichotomous characterization, right? Where there's two and only two and nothing in between categories to characterize sex, right? And this is not only true for human beings, but it's actually also true generally for zoology. That, various species of animals exhibit a whole range, a whole diversity of sex behavior, sex characteristics, and there are even more complicated cases of intersexuality in animals. And so, this is not simply even a human problem, a social problem. It's even just a strictly biological issue, that there is not a single unitary characteristic for sex, nor a way of slicing that up such that we arrive at two and only two categories that correspond with our social behavior. And so this is reflected in the Paisley-Currah reading that I asked you to do, right? Paisley-Currah's book only very recently came out, and it's titled Sex is as Sex Does. And the quote that I have from his says, quote, "The conundrum that I take on in this book is sex changes." So, in other words, what Currah is trying to say here is that, what one, say, wing or bureaucratic apparatus says counts as your sex or gender might be totally different than what another bureaucratic agency has to say about what makes you count as a certain sex or gender. So as a trans woman, right, I have a kind of deep and intimate personal experience with this because I've gone through the process of legally changing my name and also, changing my sex, gender designation on my driver's license. And, if you are in the situation where you're trans and you want your identification to reflect your, chosen gender or sex identification, it is a quite rigorous and difficult process. I would say that I am much more skilled at navigating bureaucratic frameworks. I think I have more free time than maybe like somebody else, right? Like if I were a mom or something like that, I would have way less time to do any of this kind of stuff. And it was an extremely onerous process. It was very difficult to go through. And I've been through some, visa application stuff, very, very complicated, complex bureaucratic process. And despite the fact that, I have all this free time and, I'm an academic, so I deal with paperwork all the time, I still don't actually have all of my paperwork lined up correctly. So I got my name changed in New Mexico, and I got all my stuff in my driver's license changed. Then you have to go get stuff at the bank changed. Then you need to, change all of your various profiles at your job or your work. Your work might require certain kinds of documents for them to change your name or your designation. So, for example, UNM requested of me that I provide them a birth certificate, right, that reflected the name that I have, right, Penelope. And I was born in Texas, right? So the process for getting your both your name, but also especially your gender / sex designation for your birth certificate in Texas changed is an incredibly onerous process. And the fact that New Mexico is willing to recognize me as Penelope is not on its own enough. So the way that it used to work in New Mexico and other states like that would be that to go through the name / gender sex designation change, you would need not only to fill out all of the appropriate paperwork, you need to demonstrate, you are that person, so on and so forth, have all the stuff. But you would also need a letter from your psychologist or psychiatrist that attests to your gender identity. Now, this is extremely intrusive, right? You're being asked to essentially get permission from someone else, right, to change your gender or sex designation. And, you know, it can be quite difficult in the United States to have consistent care from one doctor that's known you, say, over a period of time. Some states, especially in the past, might have required you to be living as your desired name and gender for 2 years before you would be approved. Or they might require that you be on hormones. Or in the past, they might have required, for example, you to have scheduled or gone through sex reassignment surgery. All of this is to say that these are very, very invasive, right? You're being asked to submit essentially core aspects of your life over to a doctor and to have them like approve it, right? That you're like sufficiently trans or whatever to be able to change your name and gender characteristics. And for a long time, doctors would use this specifically to, manage to navigate the behavior of their patients. So, for example, I'm a woman, right? But I'm also married to a woman. In the past, in like especially maybe the 60s or 70s, if I were at a experimental gender clinic or something like that, they would reject me as a candidate and say that I wasn't a real transsexual or whatever. This is the old language for what we now refer to generally as transgender people. Because they would have said that, you know, my desire to be with a woman or something like that is indicative of the fact that, like, psychologically or something like that, I'm still a man. And so, they would not approve me for hormones. They would not approve me for sex reassignment surgery. They would not approve me for, you know, producing various kinds of legal documents for me. Because to them, in that case, I would not be woman enough. This is not simply something that was suffered, like, you know, by me or something like that. Like, this is a very common problem. Very often, these early gender clinics would reject people based on their race, right? If you were not a white trans person, right, they would view your probability of socially transitioning, success in socially transitioning, as lower, and therefore reject you as a candidate for treatment. Right? That's racist. That's totally messed up. That is medical gatekeeping at its very worst, right? And so, you know, what's acceptable in New Mexico is different than what's acceptable in Texas, right? So for me, for example, to change my Texas information would require nothing less than a court hearing where I would have to bring, you know, say New Mexico's acknowledgement of my sex gender, and also bring in, say a letter or something like that from a doctor that I've been seeing, and essentially try to argue in court that I'm a woman, right? And hopefully you can see sort of the absurdity of this kind of situation, right? It's like I'm trying to prove that I'm a woman, but it's like, how do you even do that, right? How do you do that in a way that is acceptable in the eyes of a state, especially one like Texas, that very much does not want you to transition, that does not believe that you're really trans, does not believe, it believes that you have like a mental illness or something like that, right? And so Paisley's book is really interesting, and it speaks to my experience, but I think speaks to a whole range of experiences where it's like, because of what Fausto Sterling said about how, well, there's not really one thing that is sex biologically, then the next step is, well, then all of the social institutions that we have regulating sex, what are they regulating, right? How do they make these determinations? How do they decide? And the answer that Currah comes to is that it's entirely social. It's something that changes, right? Different institutions, different bureaucratic organizations, they all have different standards for these designations, and this hurts people, right? So, for example, for me, it could have really hurt me not having my birth certificate, because it could mean that UNM could, for example, could have just simply decided, oh, you don't have the appropriate paperwork, we're not going to refer to you as Penelope, too bad, so sad, see you later, right? And it's a significant curtailment of your freedoms if you don't have the basic ability to participate in kinds of institutions, right? You don't have even the legal paperwork that reflects your name and your gender and your, desired way of referring to you, right? It causes a lot of trans people to just disinvest from these institutions. But in any case, I hope that the combination of the Fausto Sterling, which is a real classic in feminist scholarship, and the Paisley Currah, which is a very recent contribution to feminist and trans theory, can help open up the world of feminist theory and activism in history and scholarship to you. What we've seen here is a denaturalization between Fausto Sterling and Currah of the idea of sex, and seeing how sex is not just something biological, but is also something inextricably social, that we regulate, that we govern, that we administer, and so on. I hope that you found this interesting. I very much look forward to what you have to say in the discussion forum for this week, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.